Happy Saturday to you. I hope this message finds you doing well. I'm Chris Wiley checking in live, notes from the field. Today we're talking about freedom, and I figured I'd share some thoughts. And honestly, it's been a while since I've done any podcast episodes, but I think this will be something interesting to give you my own monologue version of thoughts. Uh, Stay with me. Writer Maggie Nelson writes, "Stop here if you want to talk about freedom, a crisis of freedom, the knot, the entanglement, the stranglement. Freedom is mine, and I know how I feel," is what she writes. She further discusses, the idea of the concept of talking with what the word freedom means with her friends. And one friend detailed, "Freedom. Can you think of a more depleted, weaponized word?" Another one said, "I used to care about freedom. Now I care about love. Freedom feels like a corrupt, empty code word for war, a commercial export, something a patriarch might give or rescind." "That's a white word," said another friend. Nelson writes that she agrees with her friend's various sentiments, surmising that she still cannot quit talking about freedom. Be sure when you get a chance or time to check out her book on freedom, Four Songs of Care and Constraint. We talked about this work a couple of weeks back in my classes as a doctoral student. And the questions that stood out in my mind are: what does liberation look like? What does freedom look like? What spaces, if any, have I felt free? It would also be important to note that some people are thinking, planning, discussing strategies for freedom, and other people are thinking, planning, discussing strategies for privilege. Freedom and privilege are not the same. And when we read the work in class, only a fragment of the title was highlighted at first. The full title, shall I say, of mentioning care and constraint made sense later. Because when I saw the title, my mind thought of this post on social media that reads, "The highest form of love is consideration. When someone thinks about how things would make you feel, pays attention to detail, holds you in regard when making decisions that could affect you. In any bond, how much they care about you can be found in how much they consider you." The definition of consideration means a careful thought, a fact, or motive considered in deciding or judging something. I always like the definitions of things, and I guess too within my studies of information science, I'm always interested in exploring how the meaning of a word is actually applied theoretically in reality and or in everyday life. In many ways, I think freedom, care, and consideration are all interconnected. I confess, Chris Wiley, have not always been consistent with my care and consideration relationally. There are times when I've considered others and times when I've not. There are times when others have considered me and times when they have not. I also recognize the act of care, and I have similar experiences, as well as the reality is that I've cared for people in ways that were more meaningful to me than perhaps were meaningful to them. The good news is I'm learning that when you recognize this in our own life, in your own journey, as you're looking at yourself and reflection and growing and evolving, we can make changes and begin again. It is also important to note that this practice and praxis means does not necessarily mean our relationships can be reconciled, but it is good to get better at your relational and interpersonal skills, because I'm very aware of the ones that I have missed, failed, and the ones that I'm still working on. One of the central thoughts in Nelson's work I thought about is how could there be so many varied points on what freedom is or means? Personally, I think about lived experiences and positionality within life. It can add so much context, whether we're talking about freedom, whether we're talking about physical space, whether we're talking about church, whether we're talking about life. The topics go on and on and on. Think about it this way. Last week, I had some errands to run and I was on campus, and so many people had caps and gowns on. Chosen family, biological family, peeps, spouses, partners were everywhere. celebrating graduation. And I had coffee with a friend of mine named Steph, and she asked me, had I thought about the places on campus or place that I planned or intended to take my picture when I, finished the doctoral program. At best, I'm praying and planning and taking steps toward finishing May 2025, but I haven't really thought about like where on campus I'm going to try to have a picture take or taken. I haven't even thought about that. But at the same time, as I'm telling you about this example, same campus is filled with people walking around with, parts or whole regalia, or if that's even the word that you call it, on, and their various families or friends taking pictures. It's also true that as I headed out of my library building to go run my errand, there was another guy that was having this very loud conversation on the phone. I wasn't being nosy, just saying everybody that was in any vicinity could hear the conversation. And I remember hearing the words as I walked away that said that he was saying in a loud voice, stating that he was not throwing away his future. What's my point? My point is the application experience of freedom is just as varied as graduating from a university, capping gown pictures. Though, the reality is we think about a physical space, an institution, what it can bring up for me and what it might bring up for you can be very different things, even though it's the same place. Ultimately, I also saw this website where I think it's the Creative Independent was asking Nelson about her work. And she talked about how freedom is a broad concept, and the book considers more marbled versions of freedom that could incorporate different strands within it. What does that mean? I think that means if we think about a word and freedom, we would have to think that the way that freedom might look to me and the way it might look to you, or what that experience might mean, might not necessarily be the same. And it's totally okay. Because Nelson states that within any given movement, pandemic, or relationship, whatever the encounter, we, me, you, us, have choices and we have constraints. And sometimes they're more dire in terms of their injustice than others. A practice involves an active engagement with looking at what our choices and what our constraints are at any given instance and trying to flip the constraints that aren't working for us or for our goals, and seeing how fixed some of them are, how stubborn some of them are, and whether or not they're movable. Ultimately, it is possible for me, you, us to aspire towards future versions of more liberation while also having practices of freedom, which means it isn't really the popular either or relational experience when it comes to a topic. You can have both. You can be moving forward toward it, and you can be doing daily practices of freedom, which goes back to my question, because earlier I was asking or talking about uh, what spaces, if any, have I felt free. And I thought about this because in another group, other groups, you're talking about church spaces. And I can think that, when I think about church spaces in my experiences growing up, I love Jesus, I love God, but I cannot tell you that I have always had the experience of feeling free in church for various reasons. The quick go to might be LGBTQIAS in my identity, but that's it's not just that. I just think a lot of different things were that reason. I felt freedom in terms of participating in singing groups, and it wasn't necessarily the group that was the freeing part. Sometimes it was, but it was, and it wasn't just always my participation in the group. It was also the freedom I heard singing, how so many different voices come together and the sounds that they make, and it sounded so liberating. And whatever it is that they were singing, whether it was contemporary song, it was common meter, or whether it was a hymn or something else. I mean, I grew up singing in church, and also in college was in concert choir, so we had a lot of different songs, gospel, and that these songs that were written by all these amazing composers. But it was always amazing for me to have those experiences when you went to other colleges or other colleges came to you, and it would be all those different voices. And when you would just stand and listen to the sounds that make. That was so liberating, the way that sounded, that their sound. I hope that makes sense. But it wasn't necessarily always the space. And I say it wasn't always the spaces because some physical spaces had actual rules of conformity. And I think when you think about our relationships and what it means to freedom, sometimes as we're growing and as we're evolving, you're thinking about what does freedom mean within that, relationship. And that's a personal relationship, that's a professional relationship. It's really dependent upon the person because me, you, and us, we're constantly evolving in who we are. Like who I was, a year ago, 6 months ago, 3 months ago is not necessarily the same, now. That's because I've had a lot of different experiences this thing. I've had time to reflect. And then there are other people that they may or may not have had that time. They may or may not be doing that. But the choice is still the same, which is what, Nelson is talking about when she's, mentioning that we do have choices. Some are more dire than others, but we do have absolute choices, and always thinking about how that works in relationship. Because when I was thinking about freedom and care and consideration, and I'm telling you that I thought that they were connected. I think you would have to care about other people. You would have to consider somebody else besides yourself. I think that's the biggest challenge in relationships because me, you, us can get focused, laser focused on whatever the ideal is. And in many of those situations, we can forget, even as much as we might care for the other and whatever other represents to you, we can forget, that they might have needs too, that they might want something too. And how can you, in your approach as you're growing or as you're in relationship with others, however that relationship is, be considerate of what their needs might be. And even if it is different from yours, how might your relational aspect of care, consideration, love, or within your bond consider them too? I'm just saying, these are just thoughts. And I think I don't have a universal answer because there isn't one. It's just dependent upon the person, and it's dependent upon, your positionality, lived experience, and your evolution as you're growing. Because I'm still convinced that we grow in relationship. It does not necessarily mean that that is the most exciting thing. And I'm not saying that doesn't mean relationships are not exciting. I'm just talking about all the emotions that go with that, what it means to heal, what it means to face yourself, to realize, things as they are and as you want them to be, both. When you're thinking about that, just that level of consciousness, that level of movement, and what is required when you're thinking about that. Just notes from the field. But I want you to think about that when it comes to you and your life and how you relate to it and your relationships. What does freedom mean? What does liberation mean? And how are you experiencing it? Are there things that are dire straits for you? Are there things that are movable as you continue to grow? Let me know. Encouraging Your Spirit Podcast at gmail.com or Wiley Report at gmail.com. Either way, it's me. Thanks for tuning in. Just thought I'd share those thoughts from Maggie Nelson's book because it is true when you think about life, how more than one thing can be true at the same time, but it doesn't necessarily mean that those things are mutually exclusive. That's all I got. Thanks for listening. Peace.